This video will be the first of two videos regarding the topic of mental health. And the first video is a quick summary of a book that I read by Thomas Friedman. And Thomas Friedman is an author from Minnesota, from St. Louis Park. And he's been all over the world and has written some fairly insightful books. And I've enjoyed them. I've actually done some presentations in the past. Some of you who've been around for a long time might remember some presentations on the book, The World is Flat. His latest book is called Thank You for Being Late. And it's not necessarily about mental health, but some things tie into mental health. And then a big message out of his book ties into a major concept within the suicide prevention discussion. So this video will then lead into the second video. So the book really starts and gets its name from Friedman talking about how he would do interviews or have meetings, and people would almost always be late, 10 or 15 minutes or however long. And what he found was the best part of his day were those 10 or 15 minutes where he just had time to sit and wait and watch for people or watch people around him and not have his phone out, not have his Chromebook or laptop open, but he actually just got 10 or 15 minutes just to sit and actually just think and just be. And he found that was, again, the most enjoyable part of his day. So he started exploring, why does he feel that way? And he called it being in the pause. So between meetings, there's just that little moment of time where he didn't have the anxiety that's always with us. Think about how much anxiety people are carrying these days, especially in the time of this pandemic. And he talked about a quote that said, nothing in life is actually to be feared, it's only to be understood. And now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. And we referred to that quote as far as really using the time that we have and looking for those little pieces of time to find relaxation. And it made me think of what we do with DBT, trying to find those little moments where we let our mind relax and we try and let stress go away. He talked about where that stress comes from, and he refers to it as the machine or our society or the market. He said, really, it's been driven by three accelerators. Three things have happened in the last 10 to 15 years that have really exacerbated people's stress level, that we walk around feeling anxious, that we might even be short of breath because we're in such a hurry to do things all of the time. And the three accelerators were technology, globalization, and climate change. And he really found that a lot of this happened in the year 2007. So 2007, a ton of inventions. The first iPhone, Facebook takes off after being invented in 2006, Twitter, change.org, all kinds of technology advances took place in 2007. Now, one of the things that we saw in the office, the counselors and principals, not just here, but really all across the country, we saw this dramatic increase in mental health needs in about 2009. It was very noticeable. Levels of anxiety, levels of depression, the numbers just started to skyrocket. And we initially thought that it was kind of this lagging effect of the Great Recession, that families had gone through a lot of stress, mostly financially, during that period of time between 2007 and 2009. And we were wrong. We really found out over time, and research has shown this, that there have been some very negative effects of all those technology advances, that we are so much more connected through social media, but so much less connected in person. Now, all of those technology advances happened and more, and the more is Gordon Moore. Gordon Moore founded Intel back in 1965, actually previous to that. But in 1965, he coined a theory called Moore's Law. And it's the expectation that the power of microchips can double every 2 years at virtually no cost. And that's why technology grows so quickly. And it goes at a rate that we struggle to keep up with. So the idea here is that society can feel like almost a disconnected, and that's where a lot of the anxiety that we have comes from and affects our mental health dramatically, because things are changing so fast that it's hard to keep up. And they include this graph in this book. Now, the first thing I would say is you have to give this graph only limited uh, quality, I guess, because it's really just a chart that kind of captures what people think. There's no real data saying here's human adaptability or here's where technology is. But the technology curve is described as kind of a hockey stick. And the more time goes across, the more it goes to the end of that hockey stick. And then there's human adaptability, and we only change so fast, and that is actually somewhat proven. And so the idea here is that technology has surpassed our human adaptability to change, and we're trying to catch up with it, and that's why sometimes we don't feel quite right with it. So the key here is that the smartphone is the real driver of the machine, creating all of that potential stress in our lives. We can transfer nearly an infinite amount of information at nearly no cost, and we can do it in a device that we can hold in the palm of our hand. And so it's clear that the smartphone is the fastest growing technology platform ever known to man. Acceleration 2 is globalization, and Friedman describes the big shift. Now, we might not necessarily say every job needs a college education, but whatever job needs, if we want to be in the middle class, we can't just get a job and hold on to it. And I think everybody knows that. But it requires lifelong learning. And things are changing at different rates. We see Google, which is a search engine, creating cars with no drivers. We see Apple going into the finance world. We see Amazon being a movie studio. So globalization means that different companies and different individuals are connected now. So we have more interaction between strangers. We can hop online, find a product that we like, and end up communicating with somebody halfway around the world, making that purchase and having it dropped off at our house in an Amazon box by a UPS truck. So the key here is this. The societies that are open enough, that are willing to trade and talk and share ideas and be open, those are the ones that can accept this acceleration of globalization. The societies that don't do that struggle. So they become the world of disorder. And what we really see examples here are countries in Africa and countries in the Middle East that are oftentimes driven by a religious ideology, where they don't have that flexibility to be open to other cultures, be open to other methods of education, be open to other ideas. Those countries become the world of disorder and greatly struggle. Now, here's where the third acceleration really blends in with globalization. So Friedman went to Central Africa and interviewed people, and one of the things that he thought was really remarkable is that one of the older people in one of the villages talked about how when he was a child that there were seasons. They had fall and spring. They didn't really have a winter because they were in the Sahara, but they actually had different seasons. He said now it's just summer all of the time. There are those who are going to argue that there is no climate change, but I think the data and the science out there is pretty convincing. And we saw a couple examples this summer where there were giant Saharan desert dust clouds that were created over the Saharan desert and then actually blew all the way across the Atlantic Ocean and hit Florida and Texas. And again, Friedman had done some research here in interviewing people. And what's happening is that a lot of this area, it's still small village and family farms. So a very agrarian society here. And when those farms are literally drying up and blowing away, you have people who have nothing else to do. And so it's actually having a major political shift because all of the men in these areas, the young men, are migrating to the north, to the edge of the Mediterranean Sea, to hopefully try and immigrate across or migrate to Europe, where they hope to find jobs that can support their families back home. Now, this is obviously creating major issues with politics in the European Union, to the point where England, Brexit, they left that European Union because they did not like, most people there did not like the immigration policies that were allowed. So We have these things that are all connected: technology, globalization, and climate change, all working together to change our lives and create more stress and anxiety than we've ever had before. So, what are the machine and accelerations doing to our students? Well, first of all, again, we know that you have to be a lifelong learner. And those who are going to get the best jobs and be the most successful are described as those understanding STEMpathy. So, STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, but also blending that with empathy, being able to connect with other people. And the successful students will be the ones who have one or more mentors at school, and they also are able to connect what they learn to the real world outside of school. Now, remember how connected to our students are on social media? And now think about this. The messages on social media, are they positive or negative? And we know that they're almost always negative. And so social media, you have to be this loud, angry voice out there just to even get attention, because there's so many voices out there. The more outrageous the more outrageous things a person says, the more response that it gets. And so we need to really be aware of that social media piece and how that it can help destroy things, which sometimes can be good, but social media rarely helps build it back up. And Friedman actually uses the example of the Arab Spring back in 2015, where several countries in the Middle East and in Northern Africa, young people got together on social media and brought down governments that had been dictatorships, that had been not very open to any sort of freedom. The problem is, once they got rid of those governments, they had nothing to create to backfill it. So what happened in most of those countries where they got rid of a dictator and the military simply moved in and took over power and just traded one form of dictatorship for another. So again, that social media piece that our kids are so exposed to, it can easily destroy things, but it's pretty rare that it actually helps build things up. And this is where we end up with a confidence gap. I don't know if we truly notice it, but we sometimes need to pay attention that I think our kids just don't always know what potential they actually have. So we're at a fork in the road. We're at this weird place where an individual can create a lot of chaos. And yet we also have the potential where if we all got together and actually use this technology and use these accelerations, we could probably solve a whole lot of problems in our society. So what do we really need? We need less anger and more leadership. And I really like this proverb that Friedman cites here, the idea that we do things for the long term. And we do this in schools a lot. Think about elementary teachers. You hear high school teachers talking about a student, and you say, I had that student in my class 5 years ago, 10 years ago, and they were like this. And you tell those stories in high school. Oftentimes we have a student graduate and we use this saying. We say, life will teach them the lessons that we could not. We have to sometimes trust that we are investing our time and our efforts and our emotions, and that the payoff won't come for several years, even after the student has graduated. And Friedman talks about this a lot in the book. It's really about trust. He used the example about being in Minnesota. He's lived all around the world and came back to Minnesota to visit. And a friend of his, the friend's wife said, I was driving down the road and this car cut me off and almost ran me into the side of the road. And she said, I was so mad, I almost honked. Well, that's kind of that concept of Minnesota nice. But what we know is this, is that when people are embedded in a community, when they really feel connected, that's when they feel trust. And the idea of success coming from collaboration, and that moves at the speed of trust. And Thomas Friedman talked about growing up in St. Louis Park in the 1950s and then the 60s and 70s, and how that was kind of this magical age where the Jewish community that had been in northern Minneapolis and had been highly discriminated against migrated a suburb over to St. Louis Park, where they really integrated into the community. And it really became a pluralistic community for everybody. Now, obviously, there were examples where that wasn't the case, but he really goes back and talks about what a magical time that felt like to grow up there. and how trusted everybody was and how willing people were to invite people into their own homes. And as a result, there's a long list of highly successful people that he notes from St. Louis Park that came out of that time period. Now, what happens when trust breaks down? And St. Louis Park is right next to Minneapolis. And we've seen that where trust broke down between law enforcement and between the Black community there and the protests that came about as a result. So trust is very, very difficult to build and takes a long time. And it just doesn't take very long to break down and become very chaotic if it does not exist. So trust, trust, trust. Friedman just keeps hammering away that this is what is absolutely essential for us to solve our problems and for us to live lives that are less stressful. When public and private sectors work together, in Minnesota, we've seen a good example of that. We've seen during the pandemic, we've seen the universities, we've seen the Mayo Clinic, we've seen the state, and we've seen communities all work together. It doesn't just happen. It takes a lot of work and takes a lot of effort. But strong communities are built that way, and they're typically built at the dining room table with those connections being made. So the key is to build relationships. And that really links in with our mental health piece. So, and Friedman also cites this quote here at the end of the book. He said, when asked about what's the biggest disease in America today, and this was in 2016, the Surgeon General said it's not cancer, it's not heart disease, it's isolation. And even though we're in a pandemic and COVID is probably going to be the answer to that question today, the actions of quarantining and stay-at-home orders has most likely exacerbated that isolation that so many people feel. And so it's a strange idea that we're very, very isolated, even though we're more connected than we ever have been through technology. So the idea, again, leading into the mental health discussion and then the suicide prevention, is that the key here is that we have relationships built, that we are connecting with other people. It's the best medicine for our mental health. So with that, this is the first slide on the next presentation, but please go ahead, take a couple of moments. This will end the first part of the presentation, and then click on the link for the second part of the presentation after you've taken a few minutes for yourself.